We interrupt the Crispy Crunch Breakfast with the Classics with this bulletin from the WPOD Newswire. Dateline, Chicago. The death of mobster Anthony Prettyboy DeMaio has led dwarf detective Billibob Baddins to the Ryerson Library, one of the most prestigious museums of Chicago. In the office of curator Dr. Samuel Hamill, facts are finally coming to light. An artifact, now gone missing, had been Prettyboy's apparent goal in a daring heist, but only Billy understands the true power of this ancient find, as he discovers elvish script etched along the blade of what the Ryerson calls the Singing Sword. Billy's bad day is about to get worse, as Chicago's finest is waiting for him in his office with questions about the death of mobster Benny Roletto. And now you know the story so far. We return you to our regularly scheduled programming here on WPOD Chicago.
Chapter 6. Suits and Saps. The alleyway I'd seen up close and personal earlier that morning was now crawling with flat feet of all kinds, with the neighborhood's more inquisitive types camping out on their stoops to watch the sideshow. Not that there was a lot to see from where they were sitting. Due to the safe distance at which coppers were keeping the motley assortment of bystanders, all anyone could see of the crime scene were the cops, their cars, and a lot of flashes coming from the alleyway. People with a good view were catching quick glimpses from their windows, but with a flutter of curtains or a good yank against a set of blinds, they were gone. The best way to know nothing is to see nothing, even if you can hear it over the radio. The way my uniformed escorts were hustling me through the barrier of cops holding back public eyes and curious mob fans, you would have thought I was some kind of police brass. The crowd we were muscling our way through was now screaming even louder at the sight of a dwarf flanked by cops and getting a front row to the crime scene. I kept the peepers forward, out of habit, as the voices behind me grew more distant, and the murmurs of detectives in uniforms in the alleyway became more intelligible. Suddenly, my stride was halted by a fresh-faced young kid careening around the corner of the alleyway. Sporting freckles across his nose and cheeks, he looked barely above the age limit for joining the academy. I had to stifle a snicker under the dire circumstances, but it really was hard to take the look of a farm kid in the black duds of the 15th Precinct seriously. Once I saw his eyes, though, I gave him plenty of room. I knew that look extremely well. Wore it myself decades ago, and later I found that all the green recruits wore that face in their first few battles. The first time you watch a buddy get torched by a rock dragon, or an orc drive its fist through a comrade's chest, you can't be expected to keep your food down for long. I still manage to get all queasy whenever I catch a whiff of breakfast sausage. I took another few steps back, adding to his already generous amount of personal space. Good thing my instincts were on the mark. This cop set a new distance record in cookie tossing. It would have cost me a few of the Lessinger's bills to get what was coming up out of him off of my shoes. Just then my shadow appeared for a second on the wall the rookie was holding up with one hand. Then again, and again. I could only shake my head and feel for this poor constable. His first picture in the Chicago papers wouldn't be apprehending the lowlifes threatening Chicago's innocence, nor would it be busting one of the biggest illegal bootlegging networks working out of his precinct. It would be upchucking his lunch in front of a dwarf detective.
Well,
Huffed a thick bloke from the alleyway.
if it ain't that little circus freak of Chicago coming to join us this fine afternoon. Wish I could say that I was surprised to find out that you were here this morning.
Is that what you heard, O'Malley? Well, thank the fates you finally got those damn potatoes out of your ears. I bet you're hearing all kinds of stuff now. What little civility he had in his voice dissipated like a mist after a warlock takes his leave.
I heard enough to haul your fat arse down here, you freak, you.
I shot a glance over my shoulder at the rookie, who was still trying to collect himself. And with your boys extending such a friendly invite, I replied to O'Malley with a wink and a smile. You think I'm going to stand you up? After all, this is our first date. People are going to talk. Still nothing. His face didn't budge. I wondered if some wizard had, once upon a time, slipped through a portal and cursed him as a child to grow up without a sense of humor. This mirthless creature towering over me was Chief John O'Malley, a crusty Irishman who, regardless of the prejudice I'm sure he encountered on the trip upward to his lofty office, could not care a succubus's pimpled ass whether he insulted me or not. I first met O'Malley while working on yet another divorce case, during which my client had suddenly fallen ill with a severe case of murder. Being pushed from the top of a 4-story building will do that to you. O'Malley, who had just received his police chief appointment, wanted to make his first case an open and shut one. The press quoted his claim that the jilted ex-wife had taken matters into her own hands and let gravity do the dirty work. Tribune newshounds were about to run a story on the ex-wife's arrest when an anonymous source sent in photographs of her enjoying some extracurricular business. Seen clearly in these photos of the couple enjoying a romantic afternoon in Hyde Park was a large clock, keeping perfect time in the background. In another photo taken from a different angle, an outdoor concert provided their afternoon's entertainment. It also confirmed her location at the moment of my client's fall. The story swept across Chicago faster than an ogre horde blinded by bloodlust. When the article ran, I chuckled at my reporter pal's final comment. If this is any indication of what we can expect from Chief O'Malley, perhaps we will have to place our faith in small wonders. It was a pleasant nod to me, and subtle enough that you would have to be pretty clever to pick up exactly to whom he was referring. No sooner had I finished reading than the phone rang. O'Malley was a lot more clever than he appeared. The chief had kept a giant black mark by my name ever since, taking bizarre pleasure in trying to put a chink in my chainmail whenever he could. Note, I did say trying. His cleverness did little to make up for his lack of wit. However, his inability to get under my codpiece only egged on his attempts at insulting me, and I enjoyed watching him take a swing, only to swing. Poor Mick couldn't knock one out of the park if I told him what pitch I was throwing. Whenever our paths cross, his face gets a little harder, and his hair is graced by a few more white hairs in that sea of red. Listen, Chief, if you hauled me all the way down here just to practice your battlefield insults on me, I'm flattered that you invited all the press. You must have an incredible verbal infantry at the ready. Since I'm not thinking that's the sole reason you called me here, how about explaining to me why I'm in the middle of a crime scene, by invitation, provided you talk slow, so your brain can keep up. O'Malley's beady eyes never left me as he walked over to the freckled cop and slapped a hand on the rookie's shoulder.
Go home, Donovan. You've seen enough for today.
The rookie was breathing evenly again, his pallid look accented by those freckles of his. He was one of Chicago's finest, and now his picture was probably going to wind up on the front page of the Tribune, the Daily Herald, or, fates forbid, one of those smaller, independent rags that aren't worth the paper they are written on. Yeah, I know I don't talk like a scholar, but when you are weaned on the classics and the finest voices in literature, dime store newspapers hammered out on basement typewriters are an insult in every way.
Right then, and now to you, Shorty.
O'Malley stared at me for a minute, a salt and pepper eyebrow rising slowly as he studied me standing underneath him.
If 'twere any other crime scene, I'd toss you out of here with the bathwater. But as 'tis, I think I'm going to need your professional opinion on this.
I felt a chill run down my spine as I watched what he did next. Motioning with a gesture to the alleyway, O'Malley smiled at me. At that moment, I decided that I liked him better when he was stone-faced. The remaining rookies all looked like that kid Donovan, but they were still managing to keep their lunches in their stomachs. Even the seasoned cops were looking a little rough around the edges. One way or another, everyone in that alleyway had that green look, and we'd already celebrated St. Patrick's Day, so I knew that wasn't the reason. Well, not everyone was celebrating the luck of the Irish. There was a pair of suits I didn't recognize. They weren't Chicago's finest. That much was plain from the quality of suits and shoes they wore, compared to that of the other detectives on the scene. Everyone seemed to answer to them, even O'Malley, who gave them a nod as I came around the corner. They reminded me a little, too much, of Imperial Watchguards of Trasilia. Good fighters, don't get me wrong, but Watchguards were nothing less than mindless drones who follow orders and ask no questions. Everything was carried up by the book. If not, they were writing the book. These suits looked up to give me the stare, pencils in their grasp and pressing against their memo pads, ready to pick up where their last scribbled thoughts left off. I kept my own baby blues locked with theirs. When you're 4'1", it doesn't do you any good to be intimidated. These guys were good. Usually when humans of this realm get into a staring competition with a dwarf, the dwarf wins. My best opponents for this contest back in Acryonis were elves. It is easy for elves to play this little intimidation game because of their omnipotence. Elves know everything. Just ask them and they'll tell you. We used to be pretty chummy, the dwarves and the elves, but we had a falling out once. Lots of races all try to guess why. A disagreement over battle strategies in the Great War, bad business surrounding a mining contract. Actually, if you really want to know, it was over a malt beer recipe. Anyway, while I kept walking with O'Malley in my peripheral, these guys and I were enjoying our own stare-off. Whoever these suits were, they must have been taking lessons from the elves. They didn't blink. Statues. I had to wonder if they were still breathing. I felt my own fist tighten. Ain't no way I was going to lose this stare-down with these chumps. Then it dawned on me. These were the same chumps that crashed my detective's breakfast party at Sal's. I hadn't found out yet who these yahoos were, but it was going to take a little more than a corpse at a crime scene to break that stare-off we had going. Benny's corpse, it turned out, was more than enough. O'Malley walked me right up to Benny, putting me so close to his face that if I had puckered my lips, I would have given that wop a wet sloppy right on that dirty cheek of his. Carved into Benny's mug was a face of terror, his eyes literally bulging halfway out of their sockets, a scorched tongue reaching out of a mouth stretched open in the most unnatural of screams. Now that I had my wits about me, I could only stare in fascination. His features appeared chiseled as if from granite. The mouth looked as if it had been torched. It and what I could see of his throat, all blackened like his tongue. I summoned up the courage to gently touch Benny's cheek. Yeah, it was a little weird, and I think it even shocked O'Malley. What he didn't know was, I'd seen worse. The visible skin made it out of this fight burned free, but it had lost its elasticity. Not from rigor mortis, but from the intense pain he must have experienced at his death. Poor Benny must have seized so hard from shock that he locked permanently into this gruesome position. The cherries on top of this grotesque banana split were a pair of swollen, bloodshot peepers, staring upward at the point where his outstretched hands were frozen, fingers splayed and slightly curved, as if whatever hit him caused them to curl. Had I not felt a twinge of pity, I would have worried. Not even a sap like Benny deserved a death like this. What the hell could have torched him like that, from the inside? I stepped back, pushing up my black fedora and stroking my beard. That was when I noticed the sunlight catching his shoes. In the trash can next to Benny were those imitation Italians, still sporting that professional shine and still on his feet. Summoning up the courage Chicago's finest lacked, I took a closer look inside the other can. Whatever hit Benny had sliced him across his torso into two pieces. His feet, legs, and waist were slightly bent in the second trash can, and from the burn marks on his slacks, I could see without tipping the legs to one side that the wound was sealed. A clean, white-hot burn that cauterized as it sliced. Benny would have been happy at any rate. His imitation Italian loafers made it through the attack, unscathed. The little start I gave at the beginning must have given that stupid Mick a hard-on. "You get your jollies for today?" I quipped at O'Malley, who still wore a smile I found far more unsettling than Benny's current condition. "Now how about we drop the Halloween hijinks and get back on the clock, Chief? Or are you ready to explain to all those public eyes around the corner how one of Capone's runners wound up looking like an apprentice's final test gone horribly wrong?" The smile melted from his face. Now it was my turn to enjoy getting this dink's goat.
I should have known you wouldn't be shaken by this, you little circus freak.
O'Malley seethed.
And I might just be slapping the cuffs on you, due to the nature of this crime. It's odd. And saying you're the last to see Benny Relato alive, Shorty, I'd thought I'd bring you back to the place of your deed.
Now that's hardly fair, O'Malley, I replied, feigning a severe blow to my feelings. He couldn't score a blow on me even if he took a deep breath. What makes you think I've got anything to do with this?
This has got your name written all over it, freak,
he shouted, causing everyone, even those mystery suits, to stop and look our way. O'Malley took a few steps closer. The chief wasn't tall as humans go, but hey, everyone's a beanstalk to me. Only thing is, this beanstalk had a lot of his pods growing on the inside. If he took 2 more steps forward, I'd have disappeared under that gut of his.
I don't like this kind of garbage in my precinct. And I don't like dealing with the press.
You don't like dealing with the press when you don't have an easy answer, you mean? I replied as I calmly produced my pipe from my coat. Remember the last time you slapped the cuffs on one of your quick deductions? O'Malley's patience was growing so thin right now that it appeared transparent. Judging from his next move, he must have hit a whole new level of frustration. He slapped the pipe hanging in the loose grasp of my teeth. It broke in 2 against a brick wall, narrowly missing some rookie taking pictures of the scene. It wasn't a favorite pipe of mine, but pipes weren't cheap.
Watch your step, Baddins, or I'll swear I'll have your ass hanging from a flagpole.
I could have taken a cheap shot to his jimmies, but we had too many onlookers.
Now talk. What do you know about this? You're the last person seen with Relato when you were alive.
Yeah, I was having a chat with Benny. No big to do. We were shooting the bull this morning. I had a couple of questions for him.
Oh, really? And just what might you be asking the likes of someone like Relato?
I'm not at liberty to give the gory details, and that's a good thing because this crime scene is gory enough. I can promise you that it wasn't about anything illegal. If it were, I spoke evenly, my eyes never leaving his. I'm sure you'd have heard about it, right? A staring match with O'Malley could last a solid minute, maybe 2, if he was particularly pissed at me. I don't know if it was a flashbulb or the day's tension that caused him to blink, but this stare-down ended as soon as it began. His pause, not tense so much as awkward, did catch my attention, though. When I left Benny, I continued. He was picking lettuce and orange peels out of his greasy hair.
So, things got a little rough, eh? Threw him into the garbage, did you?
Yep. Chief O'Malley provided living proof that just because you've got height does not guarantee you got brains to go with it. Hold your foot up, Chief. He leaned his head to one side.
What?
You got dungeon muck in your ears? I said, hold your foot up, Chief. O'Malley never likes it when I ask him for a favor, and a favor includes asking him something as trivial in passing as the time. Fortunately, his Irish curiosity kicked in at this point, and he brought his loafer up. Reaching into my own coat pocket where I once kept my now broken pipe, I brought out a tiny box of matches. I struck one against his sole, tipping the stick down at an angle to allow the flame to catch and grow along its thin wooden shaft. Before O'Malley could ask,
Oh, just what the hell you doing?
I flicked my match at him. Instinctively, he brought his hands up to shield himself from the already extinguished match that bounced harmlessly against the thick cuff of his coat. Hold that pose, Chief, I told him before he could throttle me. Now look at your hands. You see they're only waist high, right? If I had been your height or taller, your hands would have been higher up, wouldn't they? Well, now there you go. A clue. On the house.
Waist high? You're telling me...
O'Malley paused in his tirade, realizing he was still holding that silly pose. He lowered one hand while another thrust a beefy finger at me.
You're telling me that my hands waist high proves you ain't got nothing to do with this.
Not unless I sprouted wings and took flight, or I grew 10 feet only to shrink back again to a height the ladies love. I walked around O'Malley to the top half of Benny's body, getting a lot closer than any of these weak-stomached cops dared. See, he held his hands up high over his head. Whatever did this came from way above him.
High?
He conceded with a curt nod.
And if no man Rioleto's height were to drop to his knees as his spent legs insinuate, then a nipper the likes of you would tower over him, now wouldn't you?
Hey, Chief, insinuate. You've been hitting the dictionary again, haven't you? Can't wait to hear you when you crack a thesaurus, you wordsmith, you. I could feel his glare boring into me as I turned back to Benny's other half. Check the pants, Chief. His knees never hit the ground. Whatever hit him. I turned back to O'Malley, catching myself in my mistake. Okay, whatever sliced him did so quickly. He was probably about to beg for mercy, but was cut down before hitting the grovel position. I threw him into the trash, sure, but he was still in one piece when I did. I took a closer look at the back of Benny's torso. Come here and take a look at this. O'Malley didn't move. A stomach that big, and it's weak? Well, when you feel your lunch will allow it, take a look at Benny's back. He's got mud there. It matches the stains along the side of his pants leg here. I motioned to the thick brown grime soaked in the slacks of Benny's bottom half, and then pointed to a large patch of mud and grime in the middle of the alleyway. He must have originally landed here and here. But I left him over there, I said, pointing out a couple of overturned garbage cans and street trash scattered around them, a good 50 feet from the crime scene. O'Malley's face now reached a shade similar to his hair.
Well, if you ain't a regular Sherlock Holmes.
And I'll give you another one, Chief Watson. Looking at both halves of Benny, I slowly shook my head. Whoever did this is one cold soul. Benny was about to drop to his knees to beg for mercy, and our killer didn't give a troll's ass. At least Capone will hear you out before he buries a bullet in your brain. This ain't your typical hit. I turned back to O'Malley with one of those grins you'd see on a dragon's face right before making a final move on a hunting party. I knew this next one was going to get me off this mix hook and put yet another black mark by my name. Oh, and one more thing. You might want to check Benny's cheap excuse for a watch. Its face is all cracked to hell, but you'll see it stopped at the moment he was parted like your Red Sea. Give Dr. Samuel Hamill, curator of the Ryerson, a holler. He'll vouch for my whereabouts at that time. I got that feeling again, that feeling of the hair rising on the back of my neck. Slowly, deliberately, like a valley saber-tooth on the prowl, I turned to look over my shoulder. Sure enough, those square jaws were starting up that elvish stare-down again. Were these dinks already up for round 2? No, I held their attention for something other than making themselves the big tuna here. They weren't playing the game this time, because I had caught them looking at me. I turned back to O'Malley, who was back to his lovable, mad Irishman demeanor. So, Chief, are we done here? You need my help on anything else?
Oh, get out of here, you freak!
He barked, bending down to give my shoulder a deliberate shove. What? No goodbye kiss? That was a shame. He wasted no time to sick his uniformed escort on me, both of them eager to follow their chief's orders. When I came back around the corner, the press started screaming louder. My uniformed escort decided to get a little rougher this time, and yeah, I couldn't slight their gnome-sized brains for noodling this scenario out. They couldn't manhandle me going to the alleyway on chance it would make the front page. Not the best image portrayed to the public, right? But things were different now. By clearing myself with my academic alibi, I had granted these uniforms free rein to drag me away from the alleyway as an unwanted spectator. All bets were off, and now they could put on a little play for the newspapers to pose for pictures of Chicago's finest enforcing order. After the coppers released me with one more shove for the road, I made a quick about-face, issuing these academy grads a silent warning about pushing me around. That was when the flashbulbs went off. I could no longer hear any of the sweet sounds of my adopted home, like the L or the traffic passing by. I wouldn't have heard a flock of giant mountain condors with the way those reporters were screaming, asking who I was and why I was escorted into, and hastily thrown out of, a closed-off crime scene. I had to give O'Malley credit. It was a win-win for him. If he proved me guilty, I'd get ushered out in cuffs and the chief would score a redeeming front-page moment. If I provided an alibi, he'd order his ogres to roughly toss me out, providing yet another newsworthy moment for the press. When you're a private dick, the press is not your friend most of the time. Kind of makes the whole private aspect of your job a moot issue. This was exactly what I didn't need for now and for future jobs. O'Malley had played this card pretty well. I guess this made us even. Giving my coat a tug and straightening my fedora, I made a beeline through the screaming sea of reporters. Some of them kept pace alongside me, still trying to get answers to their questions. I left them shouting even after I hopped into an ace and whipped out my memo pad, intending to get what I had seen and heard out of my head and into my notes while still fresh in the noggin. The cab dropped me off a block away from Roletto's sorry excuse from a neighborhood. For a numbers runner in the Capone organization, skimming off the top as he was, you would think Benny would have tried to live a little higher on the hog. As it was, this would be a quick search, because there wasn't much to where the dearly departed hung his hat. Like I said before, when I was first shadowing Benny, I followed him home after one of his nights in the town, on the princess's purse, naturally. I found it amazing that from where I watched him, I could easily get a guided tour of his place. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a couple of closets, and an open room with a couch, a coffee table, and a radio. Hell, Benny's place was an insult to the word little. I hoped to beat the uniforms in checking out Benny's place, and it looked like I had done just that. No uniforms in either eye or earshot, so I knew I had some time. Not sure exactly how much, but hopefully time enough for what I needed to do. I arrived at the apartment with my wallet of enchanted lockpicks in hand, ready to work some old-fashioned magic. Then on my first glance at his flop, I slipped the tools back into my jacket. I wouldn't be needing them after all because Benny's door was wide open. Standing just shy of the doorway, I gave the interior a few whiffs, wincing at the smell of that cheap cologne he wore that morning. I also caught hints of hair cream and the hiding place of a single bottle of Canadian whiskey. Beatrice was in my grip, but the safety was still on. No need to promise her quality time if I didn't have company. From the hallway, my nose continued to search for telltale signs of anyone else still in Benny's place. With the exception of his signatures, I didn't see, hear, or smell anyone else in the room. Swapping Beatrice for my memo pad and pen, I lightly pushed open the door with my foot, breaking the silence of this pathetic apartment with a long, steady creak. Something I always gave Benny credit for when I had watched him from my hiding places. He liked a clean flop, and that was going to make searching his place a lot easier. When the door swung back, though, I thought some of my boys from Griffinos had blown through here. The closet, bed, and what little furniture Benny owned had been given a thorough once-over. Someone had obviously been looking for something, not caring in the least how untidy the place got in the process. Like Benny was going to complain about it? Standing in the middle of all this mess, I steeled myself for something I had been praying to the fates I wouldn't have to do. I had to think like Benny. I barely stomached the run-in with him this morning, and now I was going to pay homage to him by getting into his routine. As soon as I called it a day, I was going to have to take a nice, long bath. No use complaining about it. I was on the clock, and I didn't doubt that I'd be getting a phone call from Miss Lessinger once she saw my mug running on the front page of every newspaper in Chicago the next morning. If I wanted to give her a reason to keep me employed, I needed to find out more about the link between Benny Roletto and the singing sword. Seeing that 2-bit hood sliced into 2 bits had made it clear to me that the singing sword was somewhere out on the mean streets of Chicago. I needed to find that enchanted letter opener first, and perhaps string along Miss Lessinger in the meantime. Hopefully buying myself some more time on her family's payroll would help me come up with a sane explanation as to why her mob boyfriend was whacked. Telling her Anthony DeMaio pinched an enchanted sword that would have brought about the apocalypse just didn't sound credible, true as it might be. So, on to the task at hand, stepping into Benny's imitation loafers. Evidently, the bed had been made before the French maid of darkness visited. The sheets and covers were pulled back, but parts of the bedclothes still remained tucked under the mattress. It was a bed big enough for one only, so whatever jollies old Benny scored were not here. Dropping to one knee, I took a closer look at the bed springs. I would have been surprised if I found something that the earlier visitor had not. On waking up, the first thing a guy needs to do is take care of personal issues. Sure enough, by the can, I saw another section of Benny's morning newspaper. Benny, it appeared, was an early riser. Either that, or he'd pulled a long night out on the town that went right up to this morning. Whichever one it was, I hope he enjoyed his last sunrise. Upon entering the bathroom, I immediately started coughing. From its overpowering presence in the privy, I must not have been too far off in guessing that Benny bathed in that damn dragon piss cologne after all. So he got up this morning, gave himself a shower and a splash, and then, what? Off to the closet to get his suit and shoes, of course. I was more than happy to leave the bathroom and cross the bedroom, stepping over Benny's clothes that now littered the floor. I thought about that shower and a splash idea for a minute. Whenever I rolled Benny for information before, rarely would he stink up the air around me with his cologne. Why would he have started the day with slapping on that much scent? Unless he was headed somewhere popular with the nightlife types later on. It was hardly out of the ordinary for speakeasies to enjoy the party well into the wee small hours of the morning. So Benny, I thought as I stared at the empty wire hangers above my head, what time are you out and about today? I was about to step back out of the closet when I caught another blast of the cologne. It was pretty strong, and had I not paused, I would have made a bad assumption that it was coming from his rumpled clothes on the floor. The scent was not coming from the outside of the closet, though. It was coming from my feet. Following the dragon piss to a small section of the closet's floor, I found tiny flecks of paint and plaster here. Looks like Benny had cut away a bit of the closet, probably not to the knowledge or the satisfaction of his landlord, and created his own secret panel. Not as sophisticated as the ones I was used to from my days raiding keeps and castles, but a secret panel nonetheless. Whoever was here before must have been in a hurry to miss this. I pried the section away, revealing a frame that probably hadn't seen the light of day since this place was built. Taking a whiff of the panel in my hand, I recoiled slightly. It looked like the hand he used to slap his signature scent all over his face was the same hand that returned this panel back to its concealment inside the closet. Tucked inside this hidden nook was a small journal that looked no more unassuming than a library book. I smiled as I flipped it open. Not a lot of surprises for me in here, because this was the book, Benny's dirty little secret that only he and I knew about. As I've said before, I remember catching a glance of this little gem once when I started shadowing him, but I never knew where he hid it. This was the duality of Benny. He was clever enough to hide it completely out of plain sight, but he was stupid enough to hide it in his flop. It was these times when Benny provided me with a good laugh that I would miss the most. On the left-hand side were the actual numbers from Capone's racket, while along the right-hand side were his own notes on how much to skim off the top. There were also a few contact numbers jotted in the margins. I chuckled at some of his names. Most of these guys were muscle. Muscle that wanted a bigger take for doing the dirty work, perhaps? No, I didn't like Benny all that much, but I admire anyone with enough stones to swindle Scarface, and enough smarts to make friends where it mattered most. If Benny was caught with his hand in the cookie jar, he wanted to make sure he had more than enough heat to call. Close to the end of the journal, the last few pages were dog-eared on the corners. It was clear these pages had been receiving a lot of Benny's attention lately, because they were wrinkled from notes hastily jotted down, erased, and rewritten. At the bottom of one page, I found a note that looked fresh. When I ran my thumb across it, the lead from the pencil Benny used that morning smudged lightly. These leaves held dates and places with Pretty Boy's name jotted off to the left, and 2 times off to the right. Under Roletto's, DeMaio's, and Benetti's names was a list of Capone's bagmen and runners. Some of the names, Jimmy Hill, Tommy Rosa, Chuck Morris, and Luigi Morelli, I recognized. But there were names on this list that looked hard to pronounce, and coming from a place called Acryonis, that's saying something. Jimmy, Tommy, Chuck, and a few others were crossed off the list. Interesting, as I had not seen either Jimmy or Tommy for weeks. The star by Benetti's name reminded me that only a few days before I got on this case, Paulie had met with an honorable discharge from Capone's ranks. Translation: someone discharged a Roscoe against the back of his head. I transferred Benny's journal to my coat pocket and glanced at the modest alarm clock still keeping time, unaware the master served would not be coming home. I'd been there for about an hour. Given the way O'Malley ran a crime scene, I was already on borrowed time. I walked back to the main living area and, on a hunch, placed my palm against the radio. Still warm. Yeah, whoever rifled through Benny's place was not your run-of-the-mill dink. He was smart enough to leave the radio on for any news breaks. While reporters weren't allowed near the crime scene, the local wire would have picked up enough to know that something was happening in the alleyway. And he listened to the reports. Knowing if NBC announced a gangland hit in their alleyway, that meant the story reached their news desk anywhere from half an hour to an hour after the body was discovered. Don't know who you are, I thought with a grin, but you are going to be a lot of fun to cross battle axes with, pal. Turning toward the door, I heard footsteps in the stairwell. Way too heavy to be that of kids coming home from school, or the lady of the hovel returning from the market. Whomever these footfalls belonged to, they were big. Guess I'd be taking the servants' entrance. I quietly slipped out through the closest window and onto the fire escape. Pain was touching sill before the next round of unexpected guests could catch me beating them to Roletto's hidden treasure. Before I took a powder, I took out a handheld mirror I carried in my opposite coat pocket, because there are times when Mickey's chili tries to stay with me all day in between my teeth, not a pretty sight, and angled it to catch a peek at who was on the third watch of Benny's place. Well, wasn't that something? It was those stone-faced ogres from Sal's Ruins and Benny's alleyway. And they were alone. Guests Chicago's finest were still taking their time in the alleyway. Either that, or O'Malley was still mugging it up for the cameras. I gave Benny's journal a reassuring pat in my one pocket, returned my mirror to the other, and quietly made my way up the fire escape. The suits were stone faces, and they were big, but they were smart enough to leave the crime scene and find their way here. I'm sure one of them would soon make for the window and check to see if anyone was waiting to get arrested or interrogated. It was only one flight to the rooftop, so I hoisted myself up to get a more scenic look at the neighborhood. Then it was across the roof to the opposite fire escape, and a casual descent back to the Chicago streets.